Hey, everybody. Pete A. Turner, executive producer and host of the Break It Down Show. I appreciate you coming and checking out the show. We are about to have Will Reilly come on and talk about the Anointed. Where's the book at? I'll grab right here. Here we go. He'll be here in a moment. So let me just introduce the topic to you. It's Thomas Sowell's The Vision of the Anointed. And I love the subtitle, Self-Congratulations as a Basis for Social Policy. Good Lord, he starts out swinging from the top. Thomas Sowell's a fantastic writer, as a lot of us know, and in a lot of ways unchallenged in terms of his excellence in terms of economics in the 20th century, now the 21st century, leading the way, continuing to lead the way, continuing to write. And as soon as I can, I will have Will pop in. He's en route. So anyhow, this is the Break It Down Show. If you're new to us, hey, thanks for hanging out and checking us out. We do about 3 to 5 episodes a week. That may change depending on my availability to do some show hosting, but I also go door to door doing shows. So later today, I'll be going out and I'll be talking with one of my cousins for a project I'm working on, a biographical life study of my grandfather, Don, who was a World War II veteran. And so I go out and I do professional interviews. It's one of the things I do. If you're interested in that kind of thing, you can always reach out to me at peterbreakitdownshow.com. But also, if you got something to talk about on the show, you want to produce something. I've produced a lot of shows with a lot of people. So let me know if there's something that you would like to create with me, and I'll do my best to make sure that happens. For right now, what I'm doing, professional interviews for people. This is not on the professional side. This is the entertainment side. So Will and I will be talking about Thomas Sowell here in a moment. Thanks for hanging with us for a few while Will pops in. We will be going live here. Well, actually, we're live. We'll be going live with Will here in a few moments. So Break It Down Show, 1,500 plus episodes now. I'm going to probably quit counting because 1,500 is proof enough that we know how to do this. Boy, we have quite the roster of guests in the past. If you look on the YouTube channel, you'll see just keep on scrolling and scrolling and scrolling. Almost 10 years of shows. We've had, look, our musicians have sold 1.7 billion records. That's how many they've sold. It's pretty incredible, right? We've had incredible people from the military side. I'm a former spy myself, so I've talked to a lot of spies. I've got some spy shows coming up, but also in general is the strategy side of things. You look at the big picture, like China and Russia, and what should we be worried about it? What don't we have? Why don't we have to worry about it? We cover a lot of these things, but also the arts. I mean, not just musicians, but painters and writers and all kinds of things. So if you like a good broad breadth of episodes, hey, Pete's your guy, and I would appreciate your support. Do I have to say? It'd be great if you subscribe. Do I have to say that? And if you're into doing more than that, well, you can always, and I'll throw this up here on the scroll, you can always go to the Break It Down Show page and go to the PayPal link and pick your own subscription and do whatever you want to do. Basically, you'll be supporting me. You see what I do. I work hard. 1,500 episodes proves that. I get on the road and I go do things. And so I take that money and I do things like put gas in my tank. I replace equipment. This is a brand new camera with a brand new lens. So these things all cost money and time. And I'm hoping that Will be popping in here so I can quit vamping and talking about me and get into talking about Thomas Sowell. So I guess in the comments, if you guys have, how many of you rented, how many of you read The Vision of the Anointed? Let me know in the comments and I will post those up as I'm able. It's a fantastic book. I guess I will talk about myself for a second here, just because it's relevant to the topic. I've spent a lot of time overseas, hence the spy work. And one of the things I did was I looked in kind of a Sowellian fashion, without knowing it, that a lot of our policies and all of our assumptions in terms of how we were winning the war in Iraq and Afghanistan were based upon this vision of the anointed. Things like we know how to fix the farmers' problems, and then we're not going to talk to the farmers at all. Like, this is a perfect example of that. And so you find out by talking to the farmers, by knowing them and being able to break through that initial shell, which is what I do. You find out that, hey, these guys are actually interested in very certain things. They have specific needs that they need met. And the government's not meeting them, and we're trying. There we go. Here we're back. All right. Now. And there it is. Okay, great. Little hiccup with the Bluetooth there. All right. There we go. Anyhow, talking to farmers, if you don't talk to farmers, and this is Sowellian in thought, so I would say you can't improve the condition of something you refuse to understand the condition of. So if you want to deal with homeless people, you have to go talk to homeless people. You have to understand the ground truth. And these Sowellian thoughts on getting past the vision of the anointed, getting past the if it saves one person, it's worth doing, because at some point you do get the. All right, I think. There's a problem there. I got to check in with Will here. Let me see what's going on here with Will. Oh my gosh. Okay. Let's hang on one sec here. Got to do a little bit of admin stuff live. This is the fun of having a show. All right. Okay. All right. We have resent the link. We're getting things done. This is the excitement of a live show. So I appreciate you all bearing with me. We are going to get to Will here in a moment. He is at his computer. He is imminent. Either way, we talk a lot about these kind of operations where you look at things like rule of law, and you'll hear the anointed in the Sowellian sense say, "Hey, we don't have rule of law here." And then you go out and you talk to people, and you're like, "They absolutely have rule of law. It's just different than ours." So if you intend to change it to some kind of Western rule of law, there's a lot of problems within that structure. Like, for one, how are you going to build a tax base to take care of the people in Afghanistan who are like, hey, we don't trust the court system, and any taxpayer that comes in this valley, we're just going to assassinate. And no one wants to come investigate these crimes, because guess what happens when you come investigate the crime? You get assassinated. So these are problems that are not as simple to solve as a vision. And when we don't get to the root, or we don't examine our solution in any kind of way, you get this vision of the anointed problem, and then heaven forbid you ever say, "Hey, this isn't working." So that's sort of that Sowellian approach that I've seen live in the field. And though it doesn't sound all that sexy to say, "Hey, they have rule of law. Hey, they have hospitals," you're trying to solve these big problems, and you make these big assumptions, and the assumption and the ground truth, they aren't tethered in any significant way, and that becomes a real problem when you're trying to create these visions, and goes directly towards what we're talking about here today with the Thomas Sowell book, The Vision of the Anointed. All right, checking in here. All right. Say hey to Brad. Hey, Brad. I see that you checked in on the comments and everything. It's always good to have Brad around. I'm just reading some text here from Will as he gets ready to get in. Okay. Nice to meet you too, aspiring thinker. I guess we can answer some questions. Do you guys want to ask questions at all? I'm just waiting on Will. I swear to goodness. Hey, there he is. We got Will. Here we go. Hey, man. How are
Hey,
you?
pretty good. Yeah. Sorry that the link went into my junk. I just pulled it up, but good to be here talking about some Thomas Sowell today.
Give me that. This is Wilfred Reilly, and you're watching the Break It Down show.
This is Wilfred Reilly, and you're watching the Break It Down show.
Come on. All right. We get to do this. Hey, thanks for doing this, man. I appreciate you giving us all these lessons on Thomas Sowell. I
Of course.
guess let's just start this thing and tell us what is actually the vision of the anointed.
Well, the vision of the anointed is one of Tom Sowell's most famous lines, and what the triple OG means by that is that a lot of the people in the leadership class in the USA and the Western world have a vision of what they want to see in the future and what they think about humankind that's very different from what most of the other people in society believe, and very different from what's probably the truth. So the Vision of the Anointed, which I recommend everyone run, not walk out to buy, is a book where Sowell breaks this down. And there's a fair amount of empirical statistical data in this book. But he talks about a lot of the trends that we see today, like the trend toward blank slatism, which is the idea that genetics, culture, most of the things that we've traditionally thought of when we think about human societies and why they succeed, even the male female binary, those don't matter all that much. You can make people into almost anything. So, I mean, this was a big idea in communist societies, right? Like in China or Russia, the leadership team, which was almost all university educated at what for them were elite institutions, would just say things like, well, we're going to take this traditional Oriental peasant culture and we're going to reshape it. And the assumption was that it would be easy to do this, that people wouldn't hold hidden church sessions in their basements, or they wouldn't hide their pigs when the tax man came around. People are very pliable. That's part of this. Another part of the vision of the anointed is credentialism, the idea that there are a small group of elites who've received modern university education, who sort of know what the latest techniques are, who are familiar with Marxism and the conservative response, who've read today we might see the challenges to the quote unquote sex binary and the very top journals like Scientific American, who really know what's going on. And these people should guide society, and we can basically reject all the folk wisdom kind of that came before them. So in the case of education, if people traditionally have said, well, neighborhood schools that often have same ethnicity teachers, where we select teachers basically based on IQ, those work really well. And we have a lot of questions about other kinds of school. If that's been true throughout history, that doesn't necessarily mean much of anything. It should be possible, if contemporary social science theory says it is, to integrate, for example, a working class Irish school and a working class Black school and have that happen totally successfully within the course of a year. So there's the idea of blank slatism, there's the idea of credentialism. It's essentially the idea that one group of people, and in the West in the recent past, this has mostly meant upper middle to lower upper class, college educated, left wingers from big cities on the coast and by the Great Lakes in the USA, should lead society. And that the traditional bases of power and knowledge in society, the Catholic Church, for example, are almost irrelevant. They serve as impediments to the progress of this elite group. So that's the vision of the anointed. And again, this is supported by extensive quant evidence. I mean, what people who've graduated from Ivy League or Big Ten schools think their role should be in society, what people who are wealthy think about the average intelligence of those that aren't, so on down the line. So Sowell says this is kind of an issue, and this is my last sentence, but because it turns out the anointed are often wrong. Like we really, yeah, that's how you do the same kind of face. But we really do, when it comes to social scientific theory, have to go through what's sometimes called a watching window period of maybe 100 years to see if the theory even pans out. We did with Marxism, we did with sort of road to serfdom conservatism, so on down the line. So, I mean, a lot of the things that are sort of trendy today in upper class environments, like gender ideology, are very, very unlikely to stand the test of time. So in case study after case study after case study, Sowell draws this contrast between this sort of arrogant, quote unquote, anointed vision and what everybody kind of knew, where the alternative power base might be found among the police, for example, among religious folks, among fathers. And it kind of indicates that what the anointed said turned out not to be true. So he does criminal justice, sex education, so on down the line.
Yeah, I like to use these real examples because you get to see a case study of this with our wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And we would
Mm-hmm.
say, people would say all the time, like, you don't understand, Iraq is totally different than Afghanistan. Yes, that's true, but we are not. And we have the same flawed playbook. And that's when I did a lot of my collection. My job is to show, are we winning or losing? Is there a threat out there? Like, hey, you're losing every day. And it's not because of the enemy, because they're barely doing anything. They're not shooting anybody reliably. Yes, there's attacks and violence, but where you are losing is your rule of law program, your farming programs, and all these things were going on. And there was a tell, and I've written about this on my Medium account and everything. But if someone from, we'll just say the Kennedy School of Government, they're who I pick on, if they showed up, especially if they're contracted with Department of State, I knew that person was a threat to the commander's success. And this would invariably be true, Will. Like they would say things over and over again. And I'm like, oh, the smarter you are. And so I would say, because here's the thing is, in a place like Afghanistan, quant is very hard to see through a
Sure.
problem. It's all qualitative because you can't even walk up into a given valley and reliably pull information out. And I always use this example. We set up a large scale survey because the government was kept asking us, like, use the survey tool. And when they came back with a data set that was greater than the known population of the district that they worked in,
Mm.
which is code for none of that information is any good. Maybe they found, more people than we thought were possible by a factor of 10, but we don't know that. And so now you have this whole thing, and people are basing their information and their decisions on this quantitative data that is absolutely nonsense. So I would say that just to illustrate the point, like when someone from the Kennedy School of Government is sitting in the room, and I'm like, they are so far away, like their correlation to even being right is greater than one, which is not possible. But that's how bad, because they don't even realize how irrelevant, how wrong, how dismissive, how insulting they are, because they can't slow down and be the dumbest person in the room for 5 minutes.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think that there's a really interesting sentence you just said there, which is whenever we worked with one of these Ivy League assholes, that's how we used to put it in kind of a trading floor environment, an actual business consulting environment, not comparing that to the military. But whenever you work with
Yeah,
one of these guys, they're a threat. They're going to lose you $1 million. They're going to potentially get officers and enlisted men killed. And the question, and anyone who's been in a hyper competitive environment, whether that's the military, high level industry, really almost anything else, has noticed this phenomenon. There are jokes about it, like the Yale man meme. And so Sowell asks why that is. And
yeah,
I think, and it's not something that we're both just making up. You know, that whole idea of you have to be very smart to be this stupid is something that you see really, really often. Like, I don't want to keep going back to this kind of niche gender space, but a Scientific American recently ran a fucking column, excuse me, called Why Sex Isn't Binary. I think that's exactly the hitter of the column. And it was these sort of ancient Greek level sophistic word games. The argument basically was that there are two kinds of what are called gametes in human beings, sperm and eggs. That's how we divide people into sexes. But that sort of doesn't matter because which type of gamete you have doesn't predict your personality, your behavior, whether you're dominant sexually, so on. And it went on into just this kind of complex verbal argument that unless that's the case, we don't really have sexes. And all of this is just stupid, for want of a better word. That no one claims that what sex you are predicts your entire personality, that all women are 5'3" submissive redheads. So you very often have these very high IQ people tilting at windmills, burning complete straw men, and doing so in a way that again is going on while the phones are ringing on the floor, while people are, taking fire in an actual war. They can be very damaging. So anyway, getting to the point, because I'm a long talker, Sowell basically has a theory of why that is. And his argument is that there's a conflict between untested academic theory and reality. So when you look at the people that he calls the holders of traditional knowledge or the holders of the tragic vision, they tend to be people who are very intelligent but engaged in the world. So three examples might be Catholic clergy people, with nuns very much included here, police officers above the level of detective, and farmers. Like all of those are groups of people that are well known for having a 120 plus IQ, but that also have to get out there and actually deal with homeless people, with criminals, with prostitutes, so on down the line. Maybe not with prostitutes in the case of the farmer, you never know, hunting season or something. But I mean, just you have to actually make these practical decisions, like what are you planting this year, and are you
Mhm.
willing to lose the house if you gamble wrong on that? So there's that on the one hand, and then there's the issue of people from the world of theory. And something a lot of people don't understand is that most academic theories at any given time are wrong. Many have never truly been tested, even. I mean, for ethical reasons, you can't really take people and put them out into the field and run experiments to see what entirely predicts crime or STD rates or something like that. So these are just ideas people have. So when you take the idea man and you put him or her into a space where you have to make real time decisions, you can, I guess, getting to the point, you can have a lot of problems. Like the in Iraq, I know this from kind of the thinker guy side. One of our theories was that democracy works perfectly for everyone. Like there are no racial, regional, religious, tribal, so on differences in
Yeah.
how ready people are for a modern democratic state. Like Bush kept saying this stuff like they hate us for our freedom. You know, we're bringing democracy to a new corner of the world. And the reality is that if you're operating under the basis of what was at the time a very popular journalistic and academic theory, I'm thinking Max Boot, and you're trying to apply that to on the ground conditions in Afghanistan, where most people are basically Bronze Age peasants, you know, no offense to a great population, you're going to find yourself just consistently wrong. And I
Right.
guess in one sense, you're testing your theory, you're getting publications out of it. But on the other hand, everyone who's giving tens of millions of dollars to Afghan feminist movements or to grifters like Hamad Karzai is being suckered, is losing time, losing money, sometimes losing life. So the theoretical versus the practical and the real is a big concern of Sowell's, and it's something I try to keep in mind every time I write.
You talking? I mean, this is great that we're having this conversation because I've got the real world examples in many of these cases, and as you're clicking through, and I'm like, example. I've got these things because I've went out and talked to these people. I've talked to these farmers who were, in the olden days they were educated in London, but now they're a farmer because that's how they exist in Iraq to survive. It's not about their education; it's about what they have to do to live. And I talked with this one dude, and I said, what's the best thing about the Americans being here? He's like, well, we have freedom now. And I'm like, oh, cool. Tell me about that because I know about the Bush doctrine. And again, this is not a left versus right thing. The vision of the anointed. This is all these folks that think they know what the answer is. Let me put a pause in this. When I look at these things, I think about the ground truth, the people here who are doing the actual work. They're not better. I'm just saying that they're on the ground and they're interacting with people. It is possible to be on the ground and still be distant with what's going on around culturally or whatever. And then I talk about the people that are in the spaceship because they are literally like off the face of the earth and they can look down and be like, that's all of Africa. And you're sitting next to a hut in someone's plastic chair while they feed you their food. These are different realities. And my job was to try to communicate up to the spaceship so that they could slow
That's
the
yeah.
fuck down and try to make better decisions. So I'm talking to this cat, this farmer in Iraq, and he's like, freedom, freedom, freedom. We love you guys. And I realized his freedom was different when he said the next little part of our conversation. He said, the other day I had to go up my roof and I had to beat the crap out of my daughter because she was dawdling up there while she was hanging the laundry. And it took me a long time to figure this out. But what he was saying to me is, I love freedom, but you still have to mind your P's and Q's around here. If people see my daughter up there too long, they're going to think she's a whore and that I'm a bad dad. And that's going to put us on Front Street and that'll get people killed. So I go up there and openly beat her because that's how I protect my family. That doesn't make sense to the anointed, but I sure as hell get it on this end. And I don't condone it, but I understand that they live in a different world with different stakes.
Yeah, and it's very hard to apply abstract moral principles. I think a word both of us sometimes put in quotes when it comes to real things to practical on the ground situations. And you keep seeing this over and over and over again with anointed decision makers. So, I mean, this was the whole thing during COVID-19, right? Like, I think most people that come from a hood or military or an agriculture or whatever, you have to make real decisions background. It went in with the starting premise that although it sucks that people die, especially countrymen, you can't shut down a first world society to prevent a 10% increase in the death rate concentrated among people who are 81. That's a starting premise. And there are reasons for that. Because you're drawing on that basis of core, real kind of barbershop and small town library knowledge that we all have, where at some level, suicides are going to increase if you do that. At some level, rates of alcoholism are going to spike if you do that. You've talked to a lot of small businessmen. Both of us have been in small business. So you know that probably 50% of businesses, bars, and restaurants and the like are going to close if you do this. So in reality, starting from the bottom, if you will, as you just said, you have to enter with that amoral, pragmatic understanding. Like there's no way we're going to shut down the goddamn country. So what else can we do? Can we give K95s to seniors and so on? if you're coming from the spaceship, if you're coming in with the abstract moral principle that it's always wrong to intentionally cause risk to a life or something like that, you're going to end up doing something that you think is ethical, that in fact is going to cause far more damage than the unethical, predatory thing that the soldier or the farmer would have done. And this is very, very important because real life is not some abstract theoretical exercise. And this gets into Sowell's probably best point in the book, where he says that a lot of people who haven't been real leaders in real situations, and he certainly includes the battlefield here, don't understand that there aren't a lot of solutions. There are only trade-offs. So most moral philosophies are based around the idea of solving problems. You don't want to be a whore? Abstain. And I'm not being glib about that, but it's just sort of like, this is the ideal rule in the heavenly city. This is what you're supposed to do. In practice, it's very, very hard to solve a problem. Like if your rule is thou shalt not cause risk of death or something like that, an extension of thou shalt not kill, the problem with a COVID lockdown that's premised on that is that you're doubling the rate of alcoholism. And you could haul in an actuary and he could tell you what the number of deaths caused each year by male alcoholism is, right? So, I mean, it's not as though you're going to be able to avoid death and pain and so on as a human being. So you're not actually, just by following these bright line moral rules, believe all women, you know, you are not actually ushering in utopia, because utopia means no place, it's not possible. You're ushering in a new state of reality that may be better or worse than the pre-existing state of reality, but is no more perfect. And that's, again, something in any of the situations we've described. It's something that people that are coming fresh out of Bowdoin tend not to know. So again, that's the classic critique of Sowell of the elite in The Vision of the Anointed.
Yeah, nice job bringing in some Thomas More. Always appreciate that. That's a good pull. And this, so again, like I'll use myself as an example because it's proving a lot of Thomas Sowell's points. Like one of the phrases I use as a default is like, you cannot presume to improve the condition of someone that you refuse to understand the condition of. And this is literally what the Anointed does, right? Like you can't say, I'm going to improve the condition of women and therefore I'm going to do this. I've written an academic paper. I'm peer reviewed published on this topic. There's also a concept that I use of ethical saturation. And if you're always trying to do the right thing, and I have to use quotey fingers around that, you invariably will ethically saturate and the opposite will happen. And so your intention of trying to empower women will end up with, you have no idea how much harm you're doing. You're afraid to go study it. You're not capable of studying it. And therefore, I have to go find it. And let me tell you something, you're not going to like what I find, because I find bad news, because I already know as a default that we create instability in these hard places and hard times. So when it comes to homeless policy, whatever they're going to pick, they're not going to do the work to earn the right to go fix that problem.
Yeah, I like the line, earn the right to lead, earn the right to go fix that problem. I think that's, again, another sentence from the real world. But I mean, homeless policy is a classic example of this. So, I mean, you're making a point that the two great Toms, Moore and Sowell, have actually both made, which is that it's very hard to improve, or I think they would say elevate something without understanding it. And the homeless situation is a very good modern example of this, because it's a situation where the leadership team that's working on it is almost totally anointed. And they're starting with this moral vision that capitalism or something like that is responsible for the problem of homelessness. You frequently hear this line, homeless people are just like us. The problem is that they don't have homes.
Mm-hmm.
And that leads to this simplistic ethical take, which is that if it weren't for evil, we could basically, if it weren't for evil, we could give every homeless person enough money that they could move into a house and then homelessness is fixed. That's not the reality at all. If you're from the hood, or if you ever dealt with mental health in your own life, or for that matter, if you're from some parts of Appalachia, you know that it's not that hard as an able-bodied white or African-American man or woman to get a bleeping job. So homeless people tend to be homeless because of deep-seated personal issues. And the research on this is actually getting better over the past couple of years. Homeless people, something like 80% of them have 60 to 80%, no reason to even stretch that, have very serious drug problems, heavy alcohol abuse. One of the big issues that led to urban homelessness is the deinstitutionalization of mental patients. So, I mean, in the 1980s in the USA, we saw one of the few successful bipartisan policies that we've seen in the recent past. And unfortunately, it was a disaster. I mean, the left watched movies like One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, and they decided that the system of asylums that we had at that time was abusive, was inhumane. And the right under Ronald Reagan decided that they cost too much. They weren't financially sustainable. So between those two poles, between those two polarities, we moved 90+% of the criminally insane, the residents of these mental institutions, out of the institutions, out of the places where they would be forced to take their meds. And that's when people started living on the street and shitting in doorstops and, publicly screaming at themselves and you and people that aren't there. So the idea that all of these people are innocent, they can't be forcibly incarcerated, this moral idea, and what we need to do is just keep giving them money is a factually wrong idea. But until you come
Mm.
to understand that many of the homeless are fairly bad people and the rest are unable to control themselves, you're not going to put a handle on homelessness. And there are all kinds of things like this. Like you mentioned
Oh my
feminism.
gosh.
I mean, I don't want to get into a man woman thing here, but like one of the things that modern, not even research, but like conversations with men and women, someone you should have on the show is Ella Girl, the sex worker. But one of the things that modern conversations between men and women are turning up is that men and women actually are different. Like the huge majority of women prefer to be submissive sexually and to some extent financially in relationships. Like they are the guiding brain and the guy goes out and does the work and often takes the lead in the bedroom. This extends into careers, and this is all empirically measurable. This isn't us talking trash as men. Like the less mandatory kind of sex role restriction there is in society, the more men and women tend to go into stereotypical jobs. So I mean, like in Iraq, I would assume, and you'll correct me on this, but there are a great many female farmers. There are a lot of people out there doing traditional man's work if your husband was wounded in the conflict or something, because you don't have a choice. If you don't work, you don't eat. In Norway, you see a dramatic divergence where the 90+% majority of soldiers, for example, are male, and the huge majority of therapists or elementary school teachers, you can imagine why, are female and tend to be quite pleasant people. So if you're a feminist and you want women to be as happy as possible, if your starting assumption is that men are just like women, so that male dominant relationships are degrading, or that women should try very hard to be underwater welders or something like that, what you're actually going to wind up with is a situation where most women are miserable, where they're dating soft, submissive men who aren't all that pleasing, where they're doing jobs they don't want to do. And you really saw that with the actual reactions of the do it all, let's say business women during the do it all era of feminism. You could observe how happy these people were, and they were some of the most depressed human beings in history. So, I mean, with all love for the other half of the human race that sort of makes life, you have to understand what reality is. If you take this
Mhm.
false academic premise and you try to actually move that into the real downstream situation, like a marriage, you're not going to find happiness or joy.
Yeah, there's a couple of things I want to say because this is all so good. Again, this goes back to the practical application of my experience, right? So one of them is so we wrote this paper about female empowerment in conflict zones. And
Okay.
when I would bring this up to anybody who has no idea what it's like to be deployed or work on the ground, the title itself would trigger a negative response. And they would want to know which women I was talking about. And they're always empowered. And I would get this thing, and I'm like, you've not even asked me about the abstract and you're already disagreeing with me, and I'm writing a paper on how like this is how you might try to empower females in conflict zones. And so like just the fact that you can't even have the conversation, even though this is based on the very essence of what you might do. And I don't even know if we didn't even have the ability, as you know how this works. We're like, this is the thread, and then beyond this we don't know, but you have to hit these steps first to be allowed to even enter into this space. That rigor that is required to do that, it often gets lost from the anointed. And I can do this all day with all kinds of examples, but you talked about the inhumanity of things, and this is Charles Murray, and his Murray's law basically, and this is one element of it. But when you say we're being inhumane by not taking care of these people who are drug addicts and are homeless, you will invariably exacerbate that problem and create more inhumanity. And you see that now in San Francisco and their policies that are I mean, like, I don't know how you can say it's not failing. The army is being called to help them figure out how to stabilize that region.
Yeah, you saw the troops and not tanks, but what are they, strikers rolling into the city today? The National Guard is holding it down in the Tenderloin. Yeah, normally if actual soldiers with Armalite rifles are handing out bread, your society is going through some issues. Yes,
Yeah.
there's no way to deny that. So there's something I don't want to repeat too much, but that's worth noting for one more line here, and then I'll go into a broader point. But yeah, the idea that you, as a professional military man, were writing a paper about female empowerment in conflict zones, and people were responding with these ritualistic lines like women everywhere are always empowered, kind of shows what the issue is. Like, if you're
Right.
starting from a purely theoretical base point, where you have these moral sounding upper class ideas that no one who hasn't, say, been mugged wants to go on the public record disagreeing with, it's going to be very hard for you to engage information from reality. Like, women are physically weaker than men, and women, and indeed some men, are often raped in conflict zones. And there are actual specific ways you can react to that, like empowering good men or giving women deadly weapons that most of the left doesn't like, so on down the line. Even the idea that strong governance, which can sometimes include strong man governance in the third world, is necessary, is going to piss off a whole slate of people. So again, the ritual up in the top is an issue. But I think a broader point that you just touched on is that something I've always thought, initially just a personal amoral take, but now something that I've been able to defend with a lot of data, is that too much empathy is far worse for a society than too much cruelty. You never want to get to the point, you don't want to be Hitler, but that basic military or let's school in the 1980s level of bullying and shouting and expectation is actually pretty healthy for a society in many cases. If you say, and that's going to be unpopular, but it just obviously is. If you look at trends in, say, physical fitness, then as versus now, or given a certain level of harassing pressure from your buddies as versus not, what I'm saying is largely a fact. I wrote a piece about this for National Review recently called "The Revenge of the Jocks." But banter aside, I mean, if you're talking about something where your primary motivation in terms of major domestic or even international policy is being nice or being good, the actual program that comes out of that is very likely to be a disaster, because you're not going to engage in pragmatic consideration of what the probable outcomes are
Mm.
going to be. Not only is homeless policy an example of this, like San Francisco set up a program where, and you're more West Coast, this might be a little off, but I think they were giving $650 a month per bum to homeless people, per homeless individual, people prefer. And they were doing all these other things, like you're legally allowed to camp in public. The police can't raid the quote unquote domicile of a homeless person, which might be, a Safeway carton under a bridge, without mockery. All of these provisions were put in place to make the homeless happier, make the homeless better treated. And what's currently utterly shocking people in SF and Oakland and Central California in general is that the homeless population keeps growing. And they don't understand why, because they have the kindest, most up-to-date homeless policy in the world. And again, anyone coming from that tragic vision is going to understand exactly why the homeless population is growing, because if you feed cats, you get kittens. It's this conflict almost between like the extremely simple logic here, where I think both of us fall, and the moral perspective up here that no one really wants to disagree with, but which is just clearly wrong from an amoral, pragmatic perspective. But even beyond the homeless, I mean, immigration policy. Like, if your idea is that borders are troubling and most human beings are good people, and by the way, I kind of agree with both those things. But if you just start from that and you ritualize those premises, you're going to implement programs that sound humane, like anyone to reach the border can apply for asylum, regardless of source country. The issue is that the downstream results of that aren't going to make sense.
Right.
You're going to have what we have now, which is millions of people from stable second world countries like Mexico, Poland, Jamaica, the Central American countries that aren't in a state of conflict, suddenly saying that they have to be in this country and coming here in the millions in a manner that we can't really effectively handle. So again, just stripped of all the language about who's right from an ethical perspective, you have to do things that make logical sense for your society and your group of people in order to function as a leader. And many or most of these theoretical ideas, in my experience, make that more difficult. Does what I'm saying so far make sense, by the way?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay,
No,
cool.
I'm not interrupting you, even though I want to, because
Oh, no, no,
you're
yeah,
the guest,
obviously.
and I have a lot of things to say about this. Because again, I've seen the practical application of this, and you have these things where people talk about emotional intelligence, but they are completely, and I'm going to be nice here, they're completely ignorant of cultural intelligence, which is an actual thing. And if you
Okay.
can handle cultural intelligence situations, you can navigate EQ situations a little more easily. But if you ignore culture, culture is like gravity. It gets its cut, and you don't see it, but it's going to happen. So you talk about taking a farmer and retraining them on how to do something that's Western. Guess what they're not going to do? Well, they're not going to bet the house on it. But if you go and talk to them and say, hey, what's your biggest problem? And they say security, and they can describe to you intelligently what security is for them, and that nothing will change until that first problem is solved. Like, okay, so I had a mayor say to me, um, females are my number one priority. And I said, okay, great. What do we do? He's like, well, first thing we do is we have to provide three different levels of security. And he broke that down. And I'm like, he put boys before girls, even though they were his number one priority, because none of that could empower women and get women to get to these goals until you had accomplished these other things, even though they were the number one thing. And he loved women being able to be educated. What we struggle to understand is there is a path that has to be sorted out first, because you can't take young village Afghan girls and send them off to colleges
Of course.
reliably and get them schooled and trained. And that blows people's minds. And so this is kind of the part of the mascot things. Like, you take these girls and you turn them into these things where everybody feels bad, but you're ignoring the culture, which is so much more powerful.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I would actually argue that emotional intelligence is very culturally specific. Like a
Yes.
warm, caring American who's perceived as a great salesman, good local mayor, that sort of thing here would be seen as very odd and on the verge of sexually abusive by the Japanese. I mean, so it's difficult to say that there's one kind of emotional
Hmm.
or it's odd to say there's one kind of emotional intelligence. I don't need to throw a lot of other words in there, but I have a lot of issues with EQ as a concept. But yeah, there's a core theme that we're kind of hammering on here, which is that
Hmm.
most decent people, and I think this is important to realize, especially on the right, most decent people really do want the same end game goal or want a
Hmm.
positive end game goal. With a very few exceptions, I don't think that left leaning women who want abortion to be legal through the first two trimesters because of the high rate of rape in the country, and right leaning men who would favor a ban after something brief but reasonable 8 weeks. I don't think either group wants to kill babies or imprison women in the bedroom or something like that at the 80% majority level. And I think that's pretty usually the case. The question is how realistic your proposed mechanism for getting shit done is. To me, to paraphrase John Locke and make him cruder, kind of the purpose of government is to get shit done. His line was something like protect property and wage the occasional war. But the reason that we pay taxes is that you expect certain things from society. You expect the streets to be paved, the roads to be paved, and the streets to be walkable. Walkability would imply there aren't squatter camps in the middle of them. You expect crime to be kept at a level where you and your wife can exist in public without having to fight every day or her potentially being sexually assaulted. That sort of thing. So that's the reason that government exists, to provide this small set of social services. And with all the things that we are describing, the question really is which vision does a
Hmm.
better job of providing the social services that we all agree on? And I think in general, it's what Sowell calls the tragic vision, which is the
Right.
idea that humans are very limited. To break down what this actually is, the idea that humans are very limited in terms of our actual potential at any given time. We have some, although restricted, free will, but there are very real differences between men and women, for example, between groups at the genetic level. There are much larger, although sex is an exception here, but generally much larger differences that are cultural, that have been baked in for centuries, that are impossible to ignore if you're trying to do something in the Arab world. So that's point one. Humans are not infinitely flexible. Point two, I guess, would be that successful change is generally incremental. You don't have a revolution, you have a series of civil rights bills. in a functioning society. That's how you get from point A to point B. You take step one, you see if it works, you see if things have improved. And if they do, you go along the same, in business, we'd say process path, and you take step two, successful change is incremental. And I think point three from Thomas Sowell was that because of this, because of how incremental useful change is, because of how difficult it is to change core, even non-genetic things like Islam, we should place a great deal of value in long-held conventional knowledge. Like if every cop ever to exist says, gruffly, seems like some people are just born bad, and has similar theories about how to control crime, like lock up the worst and most dangerous 10% of young males, that kind of thing. It's probably a damn good idea to give those theories a lot of respect, a lot of attention, and test them before you begin testing kind of newfangled, totally academic ideas. So, in terms of vision of the anointed versus tragic vision, which provides the set of services better or leads to better provision, I'd say the TV. But part of that's because of the thing you just said in the Afghan context. How do you get practically to the thing that you want to achieve is the question. So, I mean, in your example, kind of last sentence for me, but in your example, you can't send barely literate village girls who are starting to get interested in sex but have no idea what it is and who are in this predatory male dominated society to school 2 cities away. That's not going to work. So if the idea is educating women, you can't just mutter something like all women are queens, believe them, pack the girls on buses and send them to Kandahar is a name I'm going to pull out of thin air. You have to first work with men in society to make sure they're safe. You have to work with female leaders, same reason. Also, perhaps what's the curriculum going to be? You have to find teachers. There are all these practical steps you have to take. And again, with homeless people, you can't just open up the door of a mental institution and say, now you're free, dance, which seems to be the impression that I get of how a lot of liberals feel about this guy who unfortunately was killed the other day, the Michael Jackson presenter. He was just out there. There was nothing wrong with him. He was dancing and society took him down. And the reality is that, no, there's a whole structural series of failures. If you don't make people take their meds, if you don't, the shelter system doesn't work, if there are a lot of grifters in the process stealing money, all of those things have to be fixed before you can take the guy with the mental illness and release him into society. That's the point.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. I know you and I had a brief exchange on Twitter on that. And there's a real thing. If the government is going to take the responsibility for providing security and rule of law, you deny, and I'll use the example recently of that property owner in San Francisco who's seen hosing down a homeless person, right?
Uh-huh.
And so he would agree, like, yes, I shouldn't have done that. That is wrong. However, how many times does he call the police department? They're like, they shrug their shoulders. He's like, so you leave this policing duty up to the person and their devices. And of course he does it poorly, because what is he going to do? He didn't assassinate. He's like, this is water. Yes, it's going to be embarrassing for you, but you have to leave. You're harming my business. I mean, I've got pictures of people on Market Street in San Francisco with their bed and their house laid up right next to a convenience store. And I'm like, there's no way people are going to want to do that. And we see this in this crime here. Yes, anybody should be able to ride on public transit and not be choked to death. However, there's also a social contract. When I was recently in Oakland getting on BART, there was a guy who was walking around. He was over engaging on the train. And so that makes me, and I look at him, look, I'm a combat guy, right? So there's certain responses I have to have. And I see this guy, and I'm like, this guy not only is a potential threat to me, he's a potential threat to anybody else. Is he putting on a ruse, or is he just being nice? Nobody should be that nice in public transit. You keep your head down. Maybe you give a greeting of the day and you move on. This person was walking person to person within arm's reach and talking to them. And I'm like, okay, this guy comes by me. I'm already prepared. I've got my hand on my jabbing pen and I'm going to jam him in the neck with it. Not because I want to harm this guy, but I want to protect myself. And so because of a lack of authority in the area, because the government isn't doing their job, it's left to me, it's left to the other person. I walked by a guy, this is 100% true, Will. It's a little bit gross, but this is to the point. I'm walking by a guy on Market Street in San Francisco. He's got a 2x4 like he saw Jim Duggan, and he's marching in front of his little box where the tree would normally be, but there's no tree there. And so I see that he's guarding something, and there's something in that area, but I just give him a wide berth and I walk around him. But I switch my backpack to my other shoulder, and I'm ready to pounce on this person should he put me in. And I'm a pretty big dude. So Imagine now you're a girl who's 5'2", who's your submissive redheaded that you mentioned earlier. It's a different story. What's this guy guarding? A, a 50 to 100 used tampons. And
Whoa.
so when you walk through a street like that, when the lady from LA the other day was on the news down here, and she was saying, public transit isn't that dangerous. You can say that, but unless you're out there riding it, unless you feel the fear, unless you're by yourself, it's not. And that creates these situations where a Marine is going to stand up and say, it is my job to defend these people. This person is acting erratically. I can't, in good conscience, allow something to happen. And so now I have to act. And so that's that problem of government not doing its job when it's insisting that it's its job to do it.
Yeah, I actually don't find a lot of the people you're describing all that unsympathetic at all. I mean, in the case where the guy hosed down the homeless person, my understanding is that there was an aggressive homeless person basically living outside his business,
Right.
like defecating in front. I mean, if you want to talk about disrespect, like in front of the shop. I mean, people have sexual needs. People urinate too. I mean, so this guy's like, if there's another man living in your door, I mean, I think hosing him down with water is actually a pretty mild way of telling him to go
Yeah.
away. I mean, there's a combat spray that I used in the nightlife business called Wildfire. Like, it would be very tempting if you were to engage that person and they were to respond with one threat or aggressive word to wildfire them. I mean, it's obviously you're not actually setting them on fire, but they're going to be in pain for some time. They're going to leave the premises. They're not going to come back. In Kentucky, whether or not I'd endorse this, a lot of people just shoot you. Like, if there's a castle doctrine situation in place, and there is in almost all of our major cities, and you are sleeping in front of my house and threatening me if I walk through the door, I mean, there are a lot of people that would just fire two shots and say, I'm sure honestly he was coming for me. So the idea of I might turn the hose on you if we've had multiple arguments about you living in the curtilage of my property, I don't think that's an insane reaction at all. And I think as
Right.
citizens, we need to start saying, no, the problem is that the government has collapsed and there are hobos sleeping on my property. I mean, there was a situation that a friend of mine told me about. This is Mark Starling, the well-known North Carolina radio host. But he was talking about how in some of their major left-leaning cities like Asheville, the government is actually offering people some kind of subsidy if they allow homeless people to camp on their property. There are a lot of people there with a lot of land. That's down in that Smoky Mountains region. And the whole thing just struck me as absolutely crazy. Like, do you have a daughter? Do you have a wife? Like, for insurance reasons alone, you can't have a peon village on your property like you're a damn medieval baron. There have to be rules that prevent this kind of thing. So no, I don't find that to be unsympathetic, wild behavior at all. Um, and I think even with the Neely thing, like, you can't get rid of the law and then freak out about quote unquote vigilantism.
Right.
So this Neely thing is being presented in the same, frankly, disgusting fashion that Michael Brown was, where you have a case that's either complicated or where the brother was at fault. It's one of those two. Those are the options. And it's being somehow spun as racist white guy. You know how this works. I mean, you're a white guy. You probably
Mm-hmm.
see this more often than I do. But racist white guy commits a murder. It happens so often. Everyone's bringing up the fact that before his drug problem intensified, this guy used to dress as Michael Jackson. It has nothing to do with the situation at all. Like, he wasn't shot for performing a bad rendition of Thriller. Like, in fact, he wasn't shot at all. The reason that this fight broke out, which unfortunately ended up the gentleman's death, was that this guy was on a train car and he took off a heavy black jacket that he had on. He threw it on the floor, started stomping on it, and he started screaming crazy, violent stuff. Like, one of the phrases was, it was either I'll hurt or I'll kill everyone on this train, which would have prompted most people I know, probably including me, to action, by the way.
Yeah.
Like that's a direct threat.
Yeah.
But also, like, I'm not afraid to go back to jail. Something along the lines of, you guys better help me eat, potential financial extortion there. I'm not afraid to go back again. What was the other thing he said? Talking about hunger, thirst, just behaving in this crazy, erratic fashion. And finally, not one guy, but three guys. A black guy who looked to have some MMA background, this white guy who's a former Marine, and just another guy, like a smaller, probably Latino guy. They tackle him and they put him in. One's got him in the RNC, the hold, his neck is constrained. Another guy has like an arm brace. I'm not going to try to do that while sitting here in regular clothes. But I mean, another guy has him in a pretty good like arm and leg lock hold. Like, they're holding him down on the ground, like in UFC style restraint positions. And this other guy, I don't know what the third guy's doing, but they're all active. They're all trying to prevent this very dangerous guy from engaging, from doing something. And finally, like, he stopped struggling. He'd been struggling the entire time he was in the choke, or the submission hold, more accurately. And he stops, and the men say he stopped struggling. They give it 5 seconds and they get up. That's it. Like, the idea that the one white guy ruthlessly killed this dude is not accurate. And the lies that are told around this sort of thing are almost never even close to the truth. So again, just that one sentence that either you or I said, like, you can't get rid of the cops and then punish vigilantes, quote unquote.
Right.
Like, the
Yeah.
two options are either the police are going to enforce the law or citizens are going to enforce the law. You're not just not going to have law. We're like, no young woman would ride on the train because crazy vagrants are allowed to do what they want. That's not an option. No one's going to allow that. You, or for that matter, I wouldn't allow that, much less like 50 guys on one train car. So, I mean, it just is what it is, again.
Hmm.
And that might sum up the tragic vision. It is what it is. You might want the homeless to be an American version of sacred cows, but citizens aren't going to allow that. They're not going to allow people to sit next to their girlfriend and masturbate. So, given the reality as it is, what are you going to do to manage that system you're in charge of if you're a leader?
There seems to be within the anointed vision almost incredulous, like I can't believe that this outcome happens, when you set this thing up. But I use an example from Iraq. Johnny Walker is a guy, my friend, was an interpreter, and his wife had to move all the time to stay safe because Johnny was a very well-known guy. He went on more SEAL missions than any SEAL. And so I got a chance to ask her in an interview, and I said, how many times during this era, was your safety, the safety of your family, completely out of your control? Like, how many times a month, how many times a year? She laughed and she said, how many times a day?
Hmm.
And so if you have a society where people feel safe at all time, unsafe at all times, whether it's walking down through the mission, and look, you can avoid the mission, but if your startup is in that area, which where startups are, you have to walk over people literally at times. You can't expect people to behave in this utopic fashion, and bad things are going to happen because you've created this environment for inhumanity to occur. Whether it's I walked through San Francisco a while back. It was early morning. There's people just strewn everywhere. Like, it looked like a kegger had gone on for days. But there's filth associated with it. And every single garbage can for about 3/4 of a mile on this path that I took, every single garbage can had been kicked over. And that means all the ones around me, because I didn't go up one street. I went across several, I kind of zigzagged through, and they were all knocked over. There was just a general lawlessness. Oakland, I have a picture of a bullet hole in a BART train. This is Oakland, right? And so there's so much lawlessness. People will do things that are normal to them at the ground level. But you go to the anointed, and they're like, why would you ever travel with a weapon of some kind unregistered? You're like, because I have to go on this train to go to work. That's all I can afford. And I can't rely on you guys to keep me safe. So, yeah, I had to do this thing because I can't rely on anybody else to do it. And it's impossible for the anointed to realize that these realities are realities for people.
Yeah, and that's another thing I think that we've both emphasized a couple times during this episode, like that disconnect that's always been there between the rich and the poor, but that's even more there between kind of the religious anointed when it comes to these issues and everybody else. So, like, I grew up in the hood, not like the Marcy projects in New York, but like I was born in Chicago. I lived on the South Side for a bit. I moved to nearby East Aurora, which is one of the highest murder areas in Illinois at this time. And when I got to college and we started having conversations in class about violence, I and a lot of other people, this is like University of Illinois, Southern Illinois, I and a fair number of other people from these areas, like black dudes from East St. Louis, at this time, Irish and Italian, as well as black guys from Chicago. I mean, people would say, well, the problem in these slum areas is the lack of civilization. I mean, people, there's incessant gang violence, which at the time was very multiracial. Like, there's a lot of unregulated, let's say, male and female behavior. Like, you're talking about all the public sex in like some of these cities, like just girls get pregnant at 15. Like, there are all of these issues that if you know anything about African American or Irish American culture, that for all the flaws in those communities over time didn't exist 50 years ago. There are these very real problems. And like everyone from those areas would bring them up. Like, I was at track practice once with a guy named Terrence Laurie, I think. And that somebody started shooting at the school. like just drove by and started. And I don't know if this is the exact guy that was there that day, but like I remember asking a casual buddy of mine, like, "What's that?" Because we heard this cracking noise. And he's like, "Oh man, someone bucking at the school." And it was just one of those things like a rival was out in front or something. And we were by no means as dangerous as many schools in Chicago. We're technically in the suburbs. We're a little outside the limits. So you grow up with that kind of thing. You see that stuff. It's very obvious what the problem is. And when I got to college, I found that people were insanely reluctant to discuss that because of this disconnect. Like the popular theoretical idea, which has since changed a little, is that all violence in black communities, I don't know what their explanation was for poor white and Caucasian Hispanic communities. They just didn't care much about those people. But all violence in black communities is due to racism. So if you said, well, no, it's not, it's all black on black, and it's gone up by 400% from the reading I've done, even as a sophomore year man, since the civil rights era, that can't be true. You would just hit a blank wall. Or people would
Hmm.
start saying crazy stuff like, well, you know, the whites sometimes ship guns into Chicago. This is a very real theory to make us kill each other. So it's just a good way to think of this is as an almost religious belief. Like when you talk about, and maybe there are different schools of anointed thought. I mean, there are a lot of, you know, rich, smart people. So it's not just one take, although it all comes back to blank slateism and we should be the leaders. But when you talk to a Marxist or when you talk to a gender ideologue and you make this point, like all of your predictions have been wrong, like they're all off, why can't you see this? It's essentially like telling a religious person, well, you know, there's no difference in life outcomes between Christians and atheists. Maybe that implies God is not especially good or God is not real. The person will just blank out and say, well, no, it must be that he's testing us because they are a Catholic. They're not going to suddenly decide God doesn't exist. So I at least have some respect for that. But it's the same thing with any of the philosophies we're discussing. Why does Marxism never work? Because real communism's never been tried. It's very, very difficult. You can beat them in debate, but it's very, very difficult to change these people's minds. Really, when you talk to the quote unquote wokes in a public forum, you're talking to the 90% of the audience that realizes that crime is going up and is interested in why. But your actual opponent is going to deflect by saying things like, well, crime is what the crime statistics say it is. There's just going to be an absolute refusal to accept that, no, your policy was implemented and crime increased 400%, usually in my experience.
One of the things that Thomas Sowell talks about too is the changing of the meaning of words. You see this now.
Oh,
We
yeah.
can't even say homeless. Shame on us. We can't ban books, but we can certainly ban words. So now they are unhoused because that gives you an idea. Oh, if they just had a house, they would be solved. And I want to put a pin in that and say also, we tend to recycle these ideas. You know, busing will become a thing
Hmm.
again, even though we know busing didn't work and it caused a lot of problems and was rather inhumane. And so you have these changing of terms constantly trying to sort out what we're allowed to say, what we're not allowed to say, and how we describe problems, but we never actually get to the actual describing of the problems and working through what the numbers say. And is gun violence even a problem in this country? I don't even know. We can't even have that conversation to say if there were 330 million days every day and there's a given amount of violence in there, is there anything to even do about that? Or is that the level of violence that we're at? And that's a normal level of violence.
Yeah, there's a lot there. I mean, I would actually kind of agree with the gun violence comment. I mean, we keep hearing hysterically that the USA is the most violent country in the world and so on. That again is not true. It's a matter of definition. I mean, we're not in
Right.
the top 60 the last I looked. The most violent countries in the world are invariably, I actually know this because it's a point against the alt-right, right? The most violent countries in the world are invariably Caucasian and mestizo Hispanic countries in Central America where that white flows north, you know, but like Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador before they locked up what 2% of the population, which
Yemen
by
is
the
so
way is
dangerous. We can't even be in Yemen right now.
yeah, oh, and that's another thing. Like when it comes to Africa, the Arab world, Eastern Europe, I mean, a lot of their crime stats, not for like Ghana, but I mean, a lot of their crime stats for like Congo are just, you know, it's what the government says. You know, like
Right.
North Korea said they had, you know, zero COVID deaths because, you know, every time someone caught COVID, they were thrown in solitary confinement until they died, would be my guess. But I mean, it's again, like, how much do you trust the government of the DRC to accurately report murder data? Well, I would say not very much. So there might be another 10 or
Right.
15 countries you could throw onto that list of nations ahead of us. But I mean, the most violent countries in the world are those I just mentioned. Then post-slavery societies like Jamaica, we're actually in something like 78th place, and there aren't that many real countries. So the way people label us as the most violent nation in the world is to compare us to 10 or 12 all white, all upper middle income, Northern European countries with populations of like 5 million. So if you're not doing a per capita adjustment, first of all, like we're going to have far more murders than Norway in any context, because the country of Norway is the size of the state of Kentucky, roughly. I mean, so that's a reality even within the USA. I mean, if you adjust for internal demographics, a lot of the gaps between us and the Europeans close. So the black murder rate is consistently about 5 times the white murder rate, just like the white suicide rate is consistently 3 to 4 times the black suicide rate. And after George Floyd, by the way, that intensified that went up to about 8 times the white rate. So if you adjust for that, if you adjust for racial demographics, frankly, or for the kind of poverty they don't have a lot of in Scandinavia, even the post per capita gaps are more than halved, let's say. So it's completely unfair to pull up the USA on one hand, Colossus of the world, the dragon and the eagle fighting in the sky, and on the other hand, pull up Greece and say, well, there are more murders in column A. So I'd agree with that. I think that's actually a pretty valid point. But in terms of the broader point you made, like the meaning of terms like gun violence or the thing we
Sure.
just saw with homelessness, yeah, one of the things that Sowell says in this book, and there's actually a whole chapter that I think he just has fun with that's devoted to argumentative strategies. It's really not all that related to the rest of the book, but if you're a debater, it's something you need to read. Um, but I mean, one of the strategies that he talks about is what he calls just verbal redefinition. So, I mean, this is what you see constantly when you debate wokes, and it's something that is pretty obvious. We don't need to talk about it in great depth. But when Ibram Kendi says, for example, almost everyone is a racist or something of that nature, what he means is not almost everyone has a high level of racial antipathy in 2023. What he means is that I have come up with a new definition of racism. So, as far as I can interpret him reading through his books, a racist is anyone who's comfortable with the fact that systems in society, like the NBA draft, don't produce exactly identical outcomes across all the ethnic groups. Because his whole thing is that only racism can explain discrepancies in racial performance, which is nonsensical for a bunch of reasons. Like there are discrepancies in same race performance. So, most of the whites in the NBA are from the former Yugoslavia and so on. But the key point here is just that his definition of racism doesn't have anything to do with the conventional definition of racism. And this kind of wordplay is very common. With the homeless, for example, it's now become a bit passe on Twitter, for example, to use the word homeless. So with the Jordan Neely thing, we're seeing people trying to compete to be more politically correct. Like, I guess the mainstream term now for liberals would be unhoused, but some people are saying houseless, which is even better, implying that you haven't been given a house. And there's no difference between being houseless and being homeless, of course. The point is just that you're aware of these trends and vernacular. And I mean, you're now seeing even more extreme stuff from political accounts like person who is residentially deprived, so on down the line. So all of this is pretty constant. I will say one thing about it, other than that it's funny and you need to learn how to argue against it. This operates as kind of a class signaling mechanism, I think.
Mm.
Like if you keep up with all of these constantly changing bullshit terms, what you're doing is showing you are educated, you are smart, like you are aware of this. And for that matter, also that you are politically liberal, because I'm high IQ but wouldn't bother, right? I still say bum most of the time. So the thing it reminds me most of, I read a book a while ago called something like The Last Baron, but they were talking about courting in Europe, and there were all these actually like highly sexual, highly innuendo laden, but innocent sounding things that women in particular would say to young men. Like, I put my special perfume behind my ears for tonight. And these are all signals like I'm willing to go out on the equivalent of a date to promenade with you or whatever. But if you didn't pick up on the signal, if you didn't read that as a sign of willingness, to be intimate. How to PG put all these things. But I mean, if you didn't read that, or if you just were too low in class terms to understand what some of the things being referred to were, then you wouldn't be kind of date suitable. If you didn't know how to answer with what we'd call game today, you were showing yourself to be below that person's league. And I guess they would move on to the next guy. So it's the same thing with this stuff. Like if you say minoritized person as opposed to black dude, you're
Hmm.
showing multiple things at once. You're showing you're on the political left, you're educated, you're upper middle class, and you are on point with the latest BS vernacular. And that can be a very valuable thing to show. Just having your pronouns in your bio on Twitter or Facebook is a 100% identifier of your social class, the fact that you're a white collar worker, of your political leanings, so on down the line. And people are very, very aware of that. By the way, interestingly, the conservative equivalent would be having an American flag.
Yeah, yeah, totally. There's another one too. When you start your phrase with as
Oh,
instantly
yeah, yeah.
identifying yourself. It's like, okay, anything after as a comma, I'm not listening anymore because there's not a lot of rigor in the conversation at that point. We're already performing instead of, you know, making something that actually matters. I
I
want to,
actually
yeah,
Oh, sorry. I was just going to say, I don't think that one really affects quality of content much at all. It's just another signaler. Like people will often, the equivalent would be a Catholic saying a short catechistic phrase before every meal. Like it doesn't bother me. It's just someone showing adherence to a religion that I don't necessarily believe in. The wokeism, not Catholicism. But I mean, like the Brad on the sidebar, my pronouns are banana, dog, and Twitter verified. Solid. I mean, like, Your Majesty. I mean, the jokes you can have with this are endless. And
yeah,
it, fascinatingly, now people in HR seem to be terrified enough to play along. So you get weird stuff like this Republican city councilman who seems like a good guy to have a couple beers with over in Delaware, or wherever, who announced that he was a transgender Indian woman. And
yeah,
people are now referring to him as her in the local paper. So you can definitely game this on. But the as a um thing, I think is just a pointless catechistic reference. Like it doesn't really offend me. It's just like tacking on, praise the Lord, or what is the Muslim one? PBUH, peace be upon him, for the Prophet Muhammad. So
yeah,
someone would say something like, well, as a white woman, of upper middle class status with both feet still intact, I probably shouldn't be saying this, but, and then they'll go into the full thing that they were going to say anyway.
yeah.
So it's
Yeah,
a
this
lot
is
of
what
it.
I'm getting at. Like once they put that comma in there, there's no point in listening because the correlation to talking points is too high to make
That's
it
funny.
worth your time.
Just
Um,
very high
yeah,
NPC correlation there.
exactly.
All right.
The thing I want to ask you next, and then we'll start to wrap this up, is Thomas Sowell seems to be almost untouchable. Like Clarence Thomas gets hammered all the time, right or wrong, and almost to the point where people aren't be taken seriously when they go after him. But Thomas Sowell seems to be above that level. Like he's just his work is either respected or it's a danger zone for anybody who tries to attack things like the vision of the anointed. And here we just spent an hour validating through actual examples and actual data, what he's talking about. So talk about the impenetrability of Thomas Sowell's work, and then where is he missing something? This is an old book; it's 30 years old. What did he miss on?
Yeah, so I mean, I think the reason that there aren't a lot of brutal attacks on Thomas Sowell is the same reason there aren't a lot of brutal attacks on, William Julius Wilson, Glenn Lowry, for that matter, Eric Kaufman, to think of a center right political scientist who's pretty good right now. I mean, it's just what he says is serious academic stuff. I mean, some of it's written for the popular press, but all those books are, NYT reviewed, massively distributed. So it's hard to attack something that's just true. Like, I mean, if Sowell empirically uses a lot of empirical data and says, well, there's an out of touch upper class in the USA, I mean, I think he's the best person to say it, but everyone from Tucker Carlson to Hadi Madbouti would agree with that. So I think that's the reason there haven't been that many attacks on Sowell. What would I like to see from Sowell? I mean, I think he's done yeoman's work. I mean, he's on his 70th book. So, I mean, I think
Yeah,
he's done enough. But I think what people building on him can do, something I want to do, is use more kind of modern quantitative methods. This is the one, I guess, semi critique, but use more empirical tests of this kind of stuff. that's like, I'm kind of interested in filling, part of the Tom Sowell space as an academic and for that matter as a popular writer. But I also want to see empirically what the strength of the relationships between certain things is. So, like, my dissertation actually looked at the idea of white privilege. Like, in 1992, a guy named Andrew Hacker very famously went out. This is a book, Two Nations, and this is one of like the three centerpieces of the book. He went out and asked a bunch of people, entirely white as it turned out, I believe, how much money they'd have to be paid to be black. And the average answer was $50 million. And along with a single essay by Peggy McIntosh, that really became one of the bases of this idea of white privilege, what Cheryl Harris called the value of whiteness. It was the concept that in this, racist, sexist, heterosexist, cis-sexist, speciesist, imperialistic, post-colonial, I hope I got it all, society, there's a huge value to being Caucasian, and no whites would give that up. And it struck me that in the era of affirmative action in the 90s or the 00s by this point, where most people were very aware of each group's strengths and weaknesses, where blacks tend to think of ourselves as better athletes, artists, lovers, and so on than whites. Whites tend to think of themselves as better off, better business people, better on the tests. None of this is true, of course. But I mean, like, it struck me that finding didn't necessarily mean anything. So, and Hacker is a good social scientist, no hate for him. The rest of the book is solid. But I mean, even this experiment's innovative. I want to test it. But so anyway, enough of this. I went out and asked a group of several thousand people by the end of all races, how much money would you have to be paid to change, if this was possible? I gave the same scenario: your race, your sex. I threw in sexual orientation. I even threw in faith tradition, religion. And what I found actually was that whites were one of the least racist American groups. So, like, the whole white privilege argument, like, look at all this money from Hacker, Harris, et cetera, that these Caucasians would demand, look at all these advantages that they have, turned out to not really be true. In the same scenario, whites did demand, by that point, it was about 80 million, you have to adjust for inflation, but African Americans demanded much more.
Mm.
The same was true of Asians, were at least up there with whites. The most racist group, if you view this as a measure of racism at all, was old Asian men. And I was able to do then these regression tables where I looked at the impact of self-esteem and group identification and a dozen other things on this variable, like what makes people really focus on their race, really value that. And I'd like to do more stuff like that. I'm doing more academic, just pure academic work this year. So that's the one thing I would say. Like, a lot of this seems pretty testable. Like, are there correlations between going to an elite college, say, at the beginning and at the end would be an interesting test. But are there correlations between what Sowell qualitatively describes as anointed experiences and having certain quasi-moral beliefs or with negative attitudes toward the
Yeah.
general American population? You see some of this in sociology, but not a lot of it. It's surprisingly not a very
Right.
popular research topic. So I'd like to see more empirical testing of the things he says. I guess that's the one answer.
Yeah, and I guess I'll just throw this at you, and then we'll close out after that. Some of these things that we're trying to figure out with the anointed and the regular vision, that they just don't want to do the hard work of trying to figure out that do we even have an answer for this? Should we do it? We're going to let a bunch of people come across the border. Hey, I'm all about having very permissive borders and having people want it. You want to come take a chance on our country? Come on, let's go. But what happens next? And what happens after
Oh, yeah.
that? What happens after that? And the fact that, look, the first generation struggles mightily. We've seen that, and we saw this from the book that we covered last week, Ethnic America. But we have to be willing to do the hard work. And that means you get to do less stuff, but hopefully you do those things better and also be able to say, oops, that didn't work. Let's not try that again.
Yeah.
No question there, just a
Could
comment.
you repeat the last part of that just for?
Just the when you pick something to do, you pick less things. Hopefully you do those things better because there's more rigor and you've tried to actually do the hard work of understanding what the problem is, and then maybe train up somebody so they can actually go out to the field and case manage people who are broken out of being broken, and at a rate of 20% succeed in getting that one person out while the other eight cast off to oblivion. And then when you make mistakes, be able to say, hey, housing projects don't work. I don't care what you call it. We're not going to do that anymore. And actually do that. Like, these are all hard things to do.
Yeah.
especially admitting that you don't know the answer and you're not good at what you put together.
Yeah, I think the thing I would take out of that, it's interesting that that was almost kind of just a narrative discussion. Like I agree with you. I think that the thing I would take out of that is that something that would really help the anointed here, and I think probably most upper classes historically, is the ability to admit when you are wrong. So, I mean, you just mentioned the housing projects didn't work, and that's a situation where I think everyone says, okay, you actually can't stack poor people who drink, and we've kind of given up on that. They've given up on housing projects in Ireland as well, probably for the same reason, the North, the South. So we've been pretty open about that. But with a lot of
Yeah,
ideas, the left politically and the anointed in economic terms, you often hear that they're almost never proven wrong, like the right doesn't win culture war fights. The reason for that is that when the right or the non anointed win a culture war fight, you see this insane 360-degree pirouette where all of a sudden no one ever argued for that thing in the first place and it's never been tried. For the
right.
thing that the anointed were proposing, that the New York Times was editorializing about like a month ago.
Yeah,
So, I mean, like with defunding the police, for example, this was one of the major movements in society. There was a New York Times back page, either op ed or I think editorial, that was titled, Yes, we mean literally abolish the police. You can Google it. Yes, we mean literally abolish the police. This was a mainstream movement on the US political left. Kamala Harris gave money to the Minnesota Freedom Fund. Maxine Waters went to the site of the George Floyd riots and chanted, "We won't accept manslaughter," i.e., the verdict for Derek Chauvin, who was remarkably convicted of murder one, murder two, and manslaughter, which isn't even possible. I mean, so all of this went on for months. It went on for years. And when polling data started to show that a red wave probably was going to come in, whether that be the 2022 election, that this was very unpopular, you immediately started seeing people pirouette. And the talking point became, in fact, we on the American center left are the defenders of the law. The Republicans are the January 6th insurrectionists. Nobody ever wanted to defund. And this is extraordinarily common. Randy Weingarten, the awful doyen of the teachers union, just said we never wanted to lock down under COVID. I mean, that's flatly nonsensical. I mean, Randy Weingarten said that unless extortionate amounts of money were paid to her union, unless all these crazy pandemic policies were implemented, the school should not reopen for years. Like this is again all on record, but now no, she didn't. Nobody ever backed lockdowns. So I do think one, those of us on the center and right need to kind of pull the snail meat out of the shell when it comes to this stuff. Don't let it be forgotten. But I think that if you're a good faith person on the other side, if you want to seriously promote what you could call a vision of the anointed, a significant part of that has to be admitting when you get things wrong. Like when
yeah,
new ideas don't work, if you want new ideas coming from academia to continue to be treated seriously, it's important just to man or woman up and say, well, that idea did not work. And we see that very, very rarely. Housing projects are one exception, but COVID lockdowns like did not work. Um, Police defunding did not work. Incredibly, during the Black Lives Matter era, we've seen the black homicide rate double. So the more we can openly say this kind of stuff, the better. And the better the conversations between holders of the two philosophies, the two quote unquote visions, I think will be.
yeah, yeah. And I know you know the numbers on this, but the guy most likely to kill a black guy is a black guy, and they're the one of the few ethnic groups that's true for. Their being murdered is a very likely scenario compared to other forms of death. It's like the Native American men. I think some Mexican men are up in that area too, where if they are going to die through violence, it's usually at the hand of someone who looks like them. But we can't talk about that because that goes against the vision of the anointed.
Yeah, I
Um,
generally agree with that. I mean, I will say not that many things kill people. So when people say, for
right.
young black men, the number one cause of death is homicide. For young white men, it's suicide. Homicide's like four. And
Yeah.
people often present that as, well, we have an extraordinary gun problem in this country among blacks and to a lesser but real extent among whites. Look at these terrible, tragic tolls. In reality, for men under 40, what else is going to kill you? I
Yeah.
mean, I would
Yeah.
assume that for both blacks and whites, the top five is going to be, suicide, homicide, car wreck, alcohol,
Dudes
and
are
drugs.
violent. dudes do stupid, violent things, and if that doesn't kill you, a stupid accident will kill you. When you jump off a mountain with a squirrel suit, or all these things that taking selfies on the edge of Half Dome. Like these are things that kill people a lot too. Hey, unless you have anything in closing, I'm going to wrap this thing up.
All right.
Let's do it.
Hey, thanks for watching the show. I really appreciate it. Right here, you can subscribe. Please do that. It makes the show grow. Hit that notification bell so you know which incredible guest is coming up next. Down below is the PayPal link. You can put a small subscription in. That is an enormous help. All that money goes right back into the show. And then right up over here are the next episodes you should listen to.